Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of Newsmakers. I'm Casey Counts. Sunday is Juneteenth. It is one of the oldest holidays in the United States. It was recognized as a federal holiday 1 year ago when President Joe Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act. Over the course of the week in Las Cruces, there have been events to celebrate the day, and they will continue through Sunday. Here to talk about the day's historical significance and a lot more is Dr. Bobbie Green, the president of the NAACP of Doña County. Welcome.
Thank you, Casey. It's so wonderful to be here.
Well, it's nice to see you. It's been a while since we've been able to get together, actually in person. It's great to have you here with us today. And let's start at the beginning. On June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln, enslaved people in Texas learned that they were free. Many Americans have never learned that in the history books. And I was wondering if you could recall when you learned about that day.
I learned about Juneteenth as a child because every Juneteenth we'd go to Apodaca Park here in Las Cruces and we'd have a celebration. There was barbecue, some of the best barbecue you've ever had. And there was potato salad and desserts, and we celebrated Juneteenth. I did not know the significance of what we were celebrating. I only knew that we were celebrating in the park, and it was a good day, a fun day, and it wasn't until I became an adult that I actually knew the significance of what Juneteenth was all about. My parents are both from Texas. Their parents were from Texas, and undoubtedly I believe that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my ancestors were slaves. And so the significance of Juneteenth now is that it directly impacted my family, and as a result, the determination that people had, slaves had back then, to overcome regardless of the obstacles was pretty powerful.
You know, when we consider that it took longer for this word to arrive in Texas than it took Lewis and Clark to travel 8,000 miles in the early 1800s, what does that say about the will to free people at the time and the subsequent lack of effort to treat Black people as equal citizens?
Well, I think part of it was the free wages. I mean, slave labor that was free. They didn't have to pay. So that was motivating to keep people in the dark because they wanted to continue to get that free labor. I also think that after the word got out, a lot of Black people migrated to the north to get away from the problems and the oppression in the South. And many slave owners did not want that. Even after Juneteenth, they did not want their slaves to be considered free. And there were some slaves, after they were freed that were murdered, lynched, and what have you, trying to get away from the oppression. So even though they were free, they weren't really free.
Now, let's fast forward quite a bit to a couple of years ago. The Black Lives Matter movement led marches in cities all across the country in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Maybe you can speak to the movement's role in bringing more attention in recent years to the holiday?
Well, I think part of the reason that this became a holiday was because of the Black Lives Matter movement and the public execution, murder, however you want to call it, of George Floyd the whole world was outraged by that. And it wasn't just black people that were outraged. It was people from all walks of life, from all over the world, that said, oh no, this is unacceptable. And I believe that it just raised the awareness of people, other groups that didn't really understand what black people have been saying for years. Hey, this is, police are profiling us, they're murdering us, they're doing this. But until it was seen in vivid detail, horrific detail, people didn't really understand. And once they understood, I think there was an interest in trying to improve on societal issues and racism. At least, a lot of the public felt that way.
Now, before we move on, I'd like to talk about the emergence of Juneteenth celebrations in Las Cruces. The city website, las-cruces.org, has event information. So does the NAACP's website. And this program airs Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, but events will continue through Sunday evening. So tell us how the event was conceived and what elements were important to include, and how has the community responded?
The concept of celebrating Juneteenth, as I said before, we used to sell barbecue dinners in the hot sun in the middle of June, 100 and whatever degrees, and the food was great, but it wasn't an educational activity. So we have now tried to include some education. We've got some great speakers that are coming. Roy Collins from the General Counsel of NMSU, James Zimmerman from the Smithsonian Institute, who's going to talk about jazz history. Collins is going to talk about the history of Juneteenth. So education is a component. Music is a component. Celebration is a component. We're going to have services at all the black churches on Sunday, Juneteenth. So if you haven't had an opportunity to enjoy the power of the spirituality of a black church, this is a great time to come and participate. So we're having a full range of events that will hopefully educate and entertain the public.
Well, let's get back to where we left off just a moment ago, to what has happened since George Floyd's murder. That crime was recorded by a young woman, as you referenced, and other bystanders who were pleading with police to save Floyd. Do you believe that video was not just helpful, but integral and necessary to see justice in this case? And how encouraged are you by the conviction of former Officer Derek Chauvin and those who were with him that day?
That young teenager had the wisdom at 17 to run the cameras. She did a great job of capturing exactly what was going on. The technical savvy and the wherewithal to stand there and record. She says it haunts her. Even I listened to an interview and she says it still haunts her that she couldn't do more. And so the whole group of people that were there were screaming and yelling. I think that social media has leveled the playing field a little bit, because before it was just certain groups saying, hey, this is happening, but until there was tangible evidence that was spread throughout the social media world, Facebook and all of these social media platforms helped to get that word out. And it made a big difference. Even with cameras, the conviction rate of police officers in killings, particularly of unarmed black men, is still about 1%. So even with the cameras, it's tough to get a conviction. I was afraid that we wouldn't get a conviction even in the George Floyd case with all of that evidence, because we've seen it happen before. Rodney King, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, it goes on. The list of people who have been killed and videotaped, and the action videotaped, and still no conviction. Breonna Taylor, there was no conviction there. So there's a lot of goodness about having social media and cameras. Everybody's got a camera, but even with the cameras, it's still difficult and challenging. And it shouldn't be, but it is. Then
came Buffalo, certainly not the first time. we've seen this kind of event. The mass shooting at the Tops grocery store when 10 people were killed, allegedly by an 18-year-old white supremacist. Many people believe that this kind of hatred belonged to earlier generations, I think, but it is obviously finding a way into the hearts and minds of young people today. How does that happen, and what is our best chance to stop it?
When I found out the demographics of the shooter, my first question was, he's 18 years old. Where does that kind of hatred come from for an 18-year-old kid? You know, it's just horrifying to think that a kid like that young, could have so much anger and so much hate. It has to stem from his upbringing and what he's been exposed to as a child. It has to. And it's, you know, it's very sad because most young people, I've been teaching college for 20 plus years, so I've seen a lot of 18-year-olds come and go, and most of them are very independent thinkers, and they don't have a lot of the same issues, racism and xenophobia and things that older people tend to have. Usually, young people are very forward thinking. So I believe this young man is an exception, but there are others. I mean, we had the shooter in El Paso who had the same kind of hate in his heart, and it's just, you know, it's terrifying. That hate plus an assault rifle in the wrong hands is deadly.
And you mentioned social media as a somewhat of an equalizer, but what level of concern do you have for where people are finding themselves when they start on social media and then end up in different places on the internet where maybe they are exposed to this type of hatred from groups that are out there?
Well, it's a double-edged sword because you've got social media that can spread good information, but you also have social media, that same social media platform that can spread disinformation. And so I believe this young man, there was a manifesto, there was lots of evidence, warnings that this young man was going to do. I believe he said he was going to do it. And so it's very difficult to filter, censor, I guess, if you will, the information that's out there and what people will tend to believe and what they will swallow as a result of social media. So that's a problem. That encourages the hate.
I think if you're a certain age, you learned about that platform he was on at that time when we learned that he was on it.
Yeah.
So they come and go quickly. And it's hard to keep track of it all. In fact, white supremacist nationalist groups have been identified by federal agencies as one of, if not the greatest threat facing our country. Within the last week, there were over 30 members of such a group, the Patriot Front, that were arrested
in Coeur d'Alene,
in Idaho,
yeah.
Suspected of plotting to riot at a pride event. Do you feel that adequate efforts are being made to address this issue?
I don't, because first of all, I believe that the incident in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, I don't think they were there just to riot. I think they probably were there with other more nefarious intent, dangerous intent, which is sad. But the proliferation of guns in this country, 400, more guns than people, 400 million guns, more guns than people, and the spread of the hate, misinformation, all of those things are compelling groups who would normally be a little bit less emboldened to come out and to take action. You know, we're going to take our country back, and we're going to, you know, we're not going to be replaced. The replacement theory and all of those kinds of things is fueling some of these problems. Dangerous, very dangerous.
What do you think it will take to tackle that from a law enforcement perspective?
It's tough because law enforcement have a very difficult job. It's a lot more difficult now than it was in the past, and they have to try to weather these terrorist storms and still uphold the laws that they are hired to enforce. And it's a fine line that they have to walk, because citizens have their rights, and the law enforcement has their regulations, and we all have these rules that we're supposed to follow. So it makes it very difficult for society as a whole.
You might be reminded of the case of the group of men that were threatening Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and that they were infiltrated by law enforcement, and that later on, that became part of the problem.
And they were acquitted, by the way, of that crime as well. Mm-hmm. So it is very troubling that they can be known for planning an attack or terrorist attack, I call it, and still walk away unscathed and be acquitted of that.
Just a reminder of that fine line that law enforcement has to walk.
Yes.
Let's bring it closer to home. Politicians, including some right here in New Mexico, have tried to make critical race theory a voting issue. It's clear that many people who talk about it don't really know what it is. Maybe you can clarify it for us. What should people know about critical race theory?
It was intended for law school students to understand the issues that are faced by people who are attacked and profiled by law enforcement and other groups who have authority. That's what the purpose of critical race theory was. It is not being taught in schools, contrary to popular belief. It's not being taught in schools. And it was just an education tool for future lawyers to understand some of the issues, economic issues, equality issues, and all of those issues of their potential clients, especially if they're civil rights attorneys. That's what the purpose of it was. It's been morphed into this monster, critical race theory is being taught in our classrooms, our students are being embarrassed, and all of those things. I went to a school board meeting where they were trying to vote on cultural curriculum. I expected it to be, go in and say a few words and be pleasant and thank the school board for their efforts. And I tell you, it was standing room only. The vitriol in the room was palpable. And I was amazed because I didn't think in our city that we would have those issues. People were saying, I'm going to pull my kids out of this school and homeschool them if you do this, and I'm not going to stand for it, and you're going to embarrass my children, and you're trying to, it was really, I was saddened by it.
Were you pleased by the actions that the board was taking and with the curriculum that they were actually considering?
I was very pleased. The vote, by the way, was unanimous, and they did pass the policy that they were trying to pass, much to the chagrin of some of those who were there. But there were also others who were opponents, who were for these curriculum changes. I pointed out that I'm a product of this K through 12 public school system of Las Cruces. And we had a civics textbook, in 7th, 8th, 9th grade that was 2-3 inches thick. And I pointed out to my teacher one year, how come there's no black people in this book? I did, as a 7th grader, so, But anyway, and her response was, oh, well, there's one on page, whatever, 1. And so the curriculum was woefully, I believe I said this at the school board meeting, it was woefully inadequate for people like me, students who look like me. And this is a majority state. So, brown and black people are the majority here. So I think it's a total disservice to our students. I still do, that we're not including, it's not as inclusive as it should be.
There's no question that inequities exist today in employment, in pay, in health, housing, and education. What are some important actions that policymakers should be taking to address these issues?
Well, it's difficult because the policymakers now are being threatened by some of these domestic terrorist groups, but listening to their constituents and trying to look at what the majority of the public wants, like sensible gun laws, for example. 90% or something like that of the public believes that sensible gun laws are necessary. So you got to keep listening to what is in the interest of the public. Try to pass that legislation that's going to do the good for the public in spite of the opposition. And then, of course, we, the citizens of this country, need to vote. In the last primary, the turnout here in this city was 16.9%, I believe. So we're allowing 16.9% of the population to decide who is going to run in the midterms. That's where we are. The previous election was only 11% turnout. School board election, 11%. So we're not doing our part to go out and speak our minds and speak our voice at the polls. That's a problem.
Women of color and low-income women are expected to be impacted far more greatly should the Supreme Court decision legalizing abortion in the United States be overturned, and that could happen at any time. What does a post-Roe America look like for women of color?
Women of color have been disenfranchised since the beginning of time. I believe our income, even now, is only 66%. I think it's 77% for white women, maybe a little higher, but only 66% for African American women, even less for Native American women. So we've always been disenfranchised. We've always had those low-wage jobs most of the time. My mother was a cook, and so she cooked for other people and had 9 children. I don't know how she did it, but she did it. And many women of color are doing the same thing. They have multiple jobs, they're minimum wage. COVID was a real problem for women of color, and the income inequality, it still exists today. And if you add on top of that, you don't have reproductive rights, you don't have the right to choose. That only exacerbates the problem. Women in Texas right now are having to incur additional expense if they have an unwanted pregnancy that they don't want and need to take care of. They've got to travel, there's an expense there. They've got to take time off from work, another expense. And oh, by the way, maybe they don't have the money to travel and go the luxury of having a procedure that will prevent more economic impact.
I want to spend the few minutes we have left talking a little bit about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was, as some say, dismantled by the Supreme Court in a decision in 2013 that declared pre-clearance for changes to election law in states where discrimination was documented was unconstitutional. That cleared the way for Republican-led states to close polling places, reduce early voting, strengthen voter ID laws, and purge voter rolls in some cases. How harmful do you believe that decision was for Black and other minority voters?
It was targeted for Black voters. It was targeted for people that look like me to make it more difficult for us to vote. In an environment where we can't take time off from work. Many of us don't have the jobs where we can take time off to go vote, and we don't have the price of gas now is out over the top, and so that's an expense. And so we don't have the economic ability to navigate all of these restrictions, and so a lot of times women just say, I can't pull it off. I can't vote, even though they want to vote. And if you stand in the line in Georgia for 8 hours, you can't get a drink of water even. So I mean, it's outrageous what they've done, and their intent is a direct effort to suppress the vote.
One argument made in that decision was that this is a 40-year-old law and that the state shouldn't be held to that same 40-year-old standard. But one might think of something that was law of the land for 60 years, the decision in Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate
but equal. I say separate but equal, but not really equal. we know it wasn't equal. It was definitely separate, though, so they got that part right. But the law of the land, slavery was legal until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So the laws have to be changed when it is oppressive, and that's what we're trying to do now.
Obviously, a lot of work to be done. As the president of the NAACP, what thoughts would you like to leave our viewers with?
Well, I think that the majority of the people, I am still of the mindset that the majority of the people want to do what's right. They don't want to see oppression. They don't want to see laws that restrict voting rights. They don't want to see a women's right to choose be removed. And so I think that if we vote for the right people, and if we turn out to vote, even though it's more difficult, even though the odds are against us voting, we have to do it in spite of. I watched my parents vote for years, and both of them were, didn't have the jobs and the luxury of taking time off, but they would work 8, 10, 12 hours, and then they'd go vote. They always did. So they set an example for me that I live by now. And so if my parents could do it with 9 children and minimum wage jobs, then I certainly can do it, and so can you.
All right, Dr. Bobbie Green, president of the NAACP, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with us today.
It's my pleasure, Casey. Thank you.
And happy Juneteenth.
Thank you very much.
That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's morning edition from 5 a.m. to 9 and Fresh Air at 11. That's followed by Here and Now from noon to 2 and All Things Considered from 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Casey Counts. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.